Ooh, a new series by Greg Daniels, and is reunited with Steve Carell. It's a parody on the US Space Force too. Sounds great. Alright, let's do this. It's gonna be great. Okay, well, comedy pilots aren't always great, so I'll give it some time. That was okay. I didn't really laugh though. Not sure about the AOC parody either. John Malkovich is great. It might be too good for this, to be honest with you. Have I forgotten how to laugh, or is this just not funny? Am I depressed? Again? Oh, it's over. Thank God. When I saw the announcement of Space Force back in January 2019, I was excited for it. It was being co-created by legendary comedy writer Greg Daniels alongside Steve Carell, who he worked with on The Office. This being his second attempt at writing a comedy, having previously co-created the Naked Gun-inspired Angie Tribeca, along with his wife Nancy Ellen Carell. Daniels' resume is, to say the least, impressive. He's written on SNL during one of its few golden ages, he was a writer on The Simpsons during its golden age, most notably he wrote 22 short films about Springfield, which is considered by many to be one of its all-time greatest episodes. He co-created King of the Hill with Mike Judge, and he co-created Parks and Recreations with Michael Schur. It goes without saying, but Greg Daniels is comedy royalty, having created some of the most highly acclaimed and influential shows ever produced. We already have an abundance of satirical comedy that takes shots at the current political climate, and that's something that's arguably required. Comedy is an excellent way to punch up at those in power, but it doesn't necessarily change things. It just makes people feel better when there are others out there willing to poke fun at how ridiculous politicians are. Unfortunately, most of it tends to miss the mark, and we end up hearing the same jokes over and over again, and given that our reality is already undeniably ridiculous at times, it can be hard for comedy writers to come up with the material that rivals how ludicrous and often cruel the truth is. If you revisit a political comedy like Veep or The Thick of It, the kind of situations they find themselves in seem downright quaint compared to what we see on an almost daily basis now.
I just found out from my stupid stepfather...
Father-in-law!
From my stupid stepfather-in-law that math was invented by Muslims.
Even the creator of these shows, Armando Iannucci, says there may not be a need for them anymore because, and I quote, "I now find the political landscape so alien and awful that it's hard to match the waves of cynicism it transmits on its own, and fiction is winning out because fact is no longer making sense." He might be right too, since the majority of satirical offerings we see nowadays is honestly quite limp. Every late night host takes daily shots at the current administration, and it's rare to see an episode of Saturday Night Live that has a cold opening without some milquetoast jokes about politicians that mostly amount to "Orange man bad and stupid," all the while patting itself on the back and believing that the Democratic Party has the spine to enact any meaningful change. Even Alec Baldwin is tired of his Trump impression, and I can't blame him. Who the hell would want to pucker their lips for 10 minutes every week for Lorne Michaels?
Stop it!
Besides, Daryl Hammond did a way better Trump impression. He was robbed of that role. Unfortunately, Space Force has fallen into the same trap as the rest of these satirists, and much like them, it has noble intentions but inevitably says everything we already know and find ridiculous. And when it isn't treading over well-worn territory, it's stumbling over itself by attempting to justify the existence of these institutions that it's supposed to be satirizing, creating dissonance in its own message. There's going to be spoilers ahead, but if you haven't seen the show, I wouldn't worry about it, because you can probably predict everything that's going to happen in it anyways. But let's take a look at where Space Force went wrong. Houston, we have a mediocre show. That's really bad.
The president is creating a new branch, Space Force, which Mark will run.
What?
Part 1. Pilot malfunctions. I've always said that you can't judge a sitcom entirely by its pilot. As anyone who has ever written comedy before will tell you, writing jokes is really damn hard. Much harder than writing drama. The challenge that every sitcom faces in its pilot is simple. Not only does it have to establish the characters, their motivations, the setting, a plotline, recurring characters, and tell a story, it has to do all this while trying to tell jokes and set a tone for the kind of humor the show has. And when you're not acquainted with it yet, that can be extremely hard to do, especially for an audience member that may not have seen anything like a trailer beforehand and just happened to stumble across it. In fact, I challenge anyone to go back and watch the pilot episode of one of their favorite comedies and see whether it's good or not. For example, I recently made a video on Community, and I can unequivocally say that if I judged that entire show based on the merits of that pilot, there's no way I would have watched the rest of it. This isn't to say that all comedy pilots are bad. For example, the pilot for Comedy Central's Corporate was fantastic and did a great job of getting me invested early. By the way, go watch Corporate, it's one of the best comedies in years and it gets satire right.
Question, why do you think it's okay to come into work with your shirt untucked?
Because life is meaningless and nothing we do matters.
Okay, great.
Despite being one of the best comedy writers out there, pilots are not one of Greg Daniels' strong suits. Pretty much every show that he's created has had a particularly weak pilot. The Office, Parks and Rec, King of the Hill, they all offer some promise of what's to come, but they're certainly not indicative of the final product. In fact, you could argue that the entire first seasons of The Office and Parks and Rec were extended pilots for what's to come, given that when they came back for their second seasons they had a much stronger offering.
And my middle name is Kurt, not Fart.
What did I write?
As much as I like to offer the benefit of the doubt to sitcoms as they're taking their first steps, that goodwill can only go so far. Each episode of Space Force is around 34 minutes long, which is 13 minutes longer than your traditional network sitcom. I mention this just to highlight how much space this show had to work with its 10-episode run. That runtime in itself is a problem though. There's a reason why many sitcoms adhere to the 20 or so minute runtime, even when they're unburdened from requiring advertisements to be slotted between act breaks. It's because it helps pace shows properly. Most sitcoms have a sort of kinetic energy about them, where jokes are thrown back and forth and dialogue is generally delivered quickly in order to keep the audiences engaged. Kind of like watching improv, but of course it's scripted and there's less of an air of desperation from the actors. Space Force takes that additional runtime and doesn't really do anything with it, other than include extended establishing shots and slower paced dialogue between characters. Take another Netflix sitcom for example, Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. Most of its episodes go beyond the traditional 21 minutes runtime and go upwards of 30 plus minutes, but it still manages to maintain its pacing, and much like Tina Fey's other show, 30 Rock, it continues the pedigree of having an astonishingly high jokes per minute ratio.
You and Duke are two of the worst people I have ever met. And I once rode a ski lift with the Property Brothers.
Part 2. Picking the right crew. From the moment we're introduced to the characters, we're already aware of who they are and what kind of trajectory they're heading in, because they're all characters we've seen dozens of times before. This time they're just in a slightly more unique situation. Carell plays General Mark Naird, Space Force's Chief of Space Operations. He's your typical middle-aged white man who's spent his life working for the military, so as you can expect, he's straight-laced and stuck in his own ways. He finds it hard to express himself, and he's suppressed years of emotions to maintain a steely veneer of masculinity and professionalism. John Malkovich is Chief Scientist Dr. Adrian Mallory. He doesn't like dealing with bureaucracy, especially the military, since he's a pacifist. He's serious about his work and has an odd couple style relationship with Mark, and unlike him, he doesn't conform to traditional American masculinity. Mark has a teenage daughter, Erin, and you know what, let's play a game. What do you think Erin's character is? Is it A, she's an aspiring rocket scientist? B, she's a Twitch streamer? C, she has a shaky relationship with her dad, or D, she's the ghost of Anne Frank and she wants revenge. If you guessed A, then you're being way too optimistic, because that would mean that they actually gave her some depth. No, the answer is C. She doesn't get along with her dad because after they moved for his job with Space Force, she had to give up her life in DC, and that's pretty much it. She does some rebellious stuff, but she largely exists for the sake of showing how Mark doesn't have a great relationship with his family.
Nice. Very, very nice.
Other than occasionally getting into trouble and developing uninteresting relationships with Mark's colleagues, she has nothing going on. It's a huge shame, and despite all this, the writers still try their best to make us care for her arc, even though they didn't really do anything to earn it. I will say though that Maggie Naird, who's Mark's wife, played by Lisa Kudrow, was actually an interesting character that wasn't explored enough. At the beginning of the first episode, we see she's a pretty typical military wife, but she's upset at the thought of having to move to Colorado for Mark's new job. It cuts to 1 year after he got the job and we discover that she's now imprisoned, but we don't learn why. All we know that it must have been something pretty horrible since she's going to be in there for 40 to 60 years. As relationship dynamics go, this is an interesting and unique one. It's a decorated general in charge of a branch of government maintaining a marriage with a woman behind bars. More stuff like this might have made the show interesting. Sadly, this is about as bold as the show gets when it comes to exploring unique ideas, but I still appreciated it nonetheless. As for the other characters, there's Fuck Tony, which I assume is a play on Fuck Jerry, the douchebag who helped organize Firefest and created a career out of stealing memes and being hired to create shitty memes for Mike Bloomberg. He manages Space Force's social media outreach, and he plays your typical social media guy, loud, full of energy, making fun of older people who are out of touch for not knowing slang terms. You've seen this character before. Ben Schwartz said that he didn't want his character to be another John Ralphio, and while he doesn't reach the same levels of hyperactivity that his Parks and Rec character has, he does ultimately seem like a diet version of it. There's Angela, an aspiring astronaut, and Dr. Chan, who's Dr. Mallory's lead assistant. These two actually develop a budding relationship over the season, which was admittedly sweet. Although as characters go, there's nothing remarkable about them. There's also Kelly, who's a structural engineer at Space Force, but her character is more paper thin than Aaron. I don't think this show has a problem with women, but I do think that they need to actually give them something to do other than simply exist to add substance to male characters.
You would not be fine with that?
No!
Part 3. In space, no one can hear you laugh. From the first episode, it's easy to see that Space Force isn't like Greg Daniels' other shows. It's not a mockumentary format like The Office or Parks and Rec, and it's not your typical single-camera sitcom format. It's slower paced, loaded with establishing shots, and production value drastically higher than most comedies. The only thing that comes to mind as comparisons go would be The Good Place. That's not necessarily a problem though, but it doesn't seem like it wants to do much with the higher fidelity visuals that it has. In the second episode, there's an entire storyline where the people in Mission Control attempt to instruct a chimpanzee how to repair some panels that have been removed from a satellite. It's almost entirely done through VFX and it's well executed. The only real problem was what they actually accomplished in the name of comedy. As you can expect, it's yet another predictable scenario. The chimp is able to follow some orders, but there are problems along the way because, well, it's a chimp. There are a few jokes thrown in here and there about how ridiculous this situation is. The only thing that really stood out was the humans promising to give it a baby chimp so it could eat when it succeeded. I can't say for sure what else could have been done in this scene, but given the material they had to work with, I think it's fair to say that they could have done more. This is the only scene out of the countless many that completely fall flat though, and it's these recurring misfires that keep Space Force from being anything special. The premise of the show is a unique one, but the story with the chimp is about as bombastic as it gets. The show is far too straight-laced for its own good, which is surprising given how Daniels is so good at writing such goofy, larger-than-life characters who are also interesting. Just take Michael Scott for example, or Dale Gribble. Two ridiculous characters, but they're also layered. In general, the performances across the board are serviceable for the roles that they're given. I can't criticize the actors for their performances when they're not given much to do beyond being bland sitcom stereotypes. However, I hate to say it, but I think Steve Carell didn't do a good job playing Mark Naird. and I go as far as to say he might have been the wrong choice, even though he co-created this character. If you watch the show without ever having seen The Office, you might be able to buy him in this role, but the entire time I was watching, I couldn't help but see Michael Scott playing one of his made-up characters, like Michael Scarn in Threat Level Midnight. It really is a shame that of all the characters in this show, Carell's among the ones that made me laugh the least. On the other hand, John Malkovich is great, as always, in his role as Dr. Mallory, the beleaguered lead scientist. He always manages to nail the delivery of his deadpan wit perfectly, and some of the lines they wrote for him were fantastic.
I don't want you. You're an unfortunate necessity, like tipping or colonoscopies.
If it weren't for the sometimes charming dynamic between him and Mark, then Mark would have struggled even more as a character, but they work well when bouncing off each other. The big difference between them is that Malkovich's Mallory stands well as an individual character, whereas Mark only works well when paired with select few characters. I think one major thing that keeps Space Force from actually being funny is that there are no characters that really exist just for the sake of comic relief. The closest we get to that is probably Mark's assistant Brad Gregory. He has those weird throwaway lines that elevate Daniel's other comedies, the kind that you hear and it takes you a moment to process what was actually said. Think Creed or Dwight. Unfortunately, we don't really see much of Brad, and he doesn't have any storylines to speak of.
Somebody's gonna get vetted now. I'll kill you. I'll fucking kill you. Yeah, try it. Snap your neck like a twig.
Other than that, the only character that consistently made me laugh when they were on screen was Fred Willard as Mark's dad, and frankly, it's because it's Fred Willard. He's a comedy legend. Sadly, this was his final acting role, as he died shortly before the release of the show on May 15th, 2020, at the age of 86. Nothing will ever compare to you, Fred. You will sorely be missed. In general, most of the characters don't have personalities that mix well with comedy, and when it does try to make any jokes, it plays it far too safely. Not to say that it needs to be vulgar, but at the very least, it could be more daring. Just a little goofy or even highbrow. Perhaps a similar tone to something like Community or Arrested Development. Sadly, it seems like the show is more concerned with remaining grounded in reality than it actually is being a comedy, much to the detriment of the overall product. Speaking of which, Part 4, Pick a Lane. I couldn't think of any space-related thing for this. Unlike Daniel's other shows, Space Force isn't purely a comedy. It makes considerable attempts at delving into drama too, whether it's related to the characters' personal problems or situations they find themselves in. Much like its comedic elements though, its attempts at drama almost completely fall flat. Not only is it the case where most of the situations feel contrived or exaggerated, it's harder to be interested in when the writers haven't invested enough time or effort into building certain characters, yet they expect us to care. Take for example Mark's daughter, Erin. As I mentioned earlier, she's a severely underwritten character, and it feels like she only exists to inject some drama into her dad's life. Throughout the season, she becomes increasingly rebellious due to the distance between her and her father, largely because his job takes up most of his time. The show, however, undercuts this by having moments where they actually begin to connect and mend this rift, only for later on to make said rift larger than it ever was before. After Mark enters a relationship with a new woman who happens to be Kelly, after he and his wife agree to an open marriage. He finds it difficult to bring this up with Erin, which is fine since his character is a traditionalist, but at no point do either of them make a proper attempt to talk about it. The only time she comes close to talking about it is while Mark is in the middle of the maiden manned flight of Space Force, arguably the most important moment of his career. He tries to talk to her, she gets upset that he's busy, and storms out. If Erin was portrayed as an unstable person, this kind of behavior might make sense, but honestly, even him receiving a text saying, "I know you're cheating on Mom," would be more realistic than this. Erin starts drinking, vandalizes Kelly's car and gets fired, then goes off the rail, culminating in her running away from home, going off with a group of strangers in a gas station who take her to the middle of nowhere where they immediately proceed to smoke crack. They're extremely rude too because they don't even offer her any. She calls up her dad for help, who at this point has been detained by a general from another branch of the military. he manages to escape to a chopper and then rescues Aaron with it. This whole scene just felt like a completely forgettable Spielberg knockoff movie from the 80s. I wish there was even a hint of irony to this, or even a sly wink to the audience, but it's completely serious when it wants you to celebrate alongside it. The only dramatic element that really worked for me was Mark and Maggie's marriage problems, specifically when they discuss entering an open marriage after coming to the conclusion that they both need intimacy in their lives, and the very rare conjugal visits won't suffice. It's an honest moment that's handled really well, and for a second it made me wish that the show actually veered more towards being a drama, but as it was made clear many times, the show wasn't able to maintain a similar standard to this story. Instead, it most often chose melodrama.
I don't know about that.
I do.
Part 5. Pick a Lane 2. This time, it's political. Look, I'm really tired, okay? Jokes are hard. It's undeniable that Space Force is a show with a political core. Its very premise is based on real-life events since it's based on one of the most ridiculous branches of the military ever conceived. As I mentioned earlier, the show's satire fails almost entirely, and it doesn't ever really have anything to say that will bring into question what you think of its real-life namesake. Even though the show generally prefers to call into question whether something like Space Force should exist, which, to be clear, in a country where there's no universal healthcare, it absolutely shouldn't, it instead makes attempts to validate its existence through the lens of advancing space exploration. Now, to be clear, space exploration is a worthy endeavor, one that all of humanity should be behind. If it weren't for it, there would be a good chance that you wouldn't have many of the very basic conveniences you enjoy every day. Things like Velcro, nutritious baby formula, memory foam, and hurricane tracking is thanks to the incredible people who have worked in NASA alone. So that's excluding all of the amazing things that space programs around the world have invented too. The main functions that Space Force is intended for is supporting existing space operations such as satellites, missile warnings, which we can get anyway, and, I quote, space superiority, which is a broad term meaning that the US either wants to remain ahead of the space race or, more insidiously, take over space, which is 100% not okay. Space does not belong to any one country, it doesn't even belong to the world, and even if it did, the US is among one of the worst countries to give ownership to, unless you're really into the idea of suppressing other space programs across the world or, I don't know, space racism.
Many believe that the money was used to build underground meeting rooms for those who control the world economy. The Illuminati.
Space Force as a show is unable to decide whether the existence of a Space Force is a creation that could be used for positive means or something that was created to fuel the ego of Americans, especially its leadership. As a brief aside, this show doesn't mention Trump, but it makes various allusions to him being the president. The show has a sneering centrism to it at times. Take for example in episode 3 where Mark and Dr. Mallory head to DC to justify their budget to the House Armed Services Committee. They're up against 3 politicians we're all familiar with at this point. A sycophantic religious Republican, kind of like Lindsey Graham, the Democratic liberal establishment politician who, if I remember right, was actually called Nancy Pelosi. Sorry to stop you there past me, but I decided to check and it was actually Representative Potosi. Very subtle. Okay, continue. And a left-leaning, blatant Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez impersonation. When they're up against them, Mark and Dr. Mallory are asked by Budget AOC how they can justify spending $10,000 on sending dehydrated fruit up into space when there are people surviving off food stamps in her district, which highlights a perfectly valid point. The government spending on things such as this is absurd when we live in the richest country in the world that somehow can't afford to keep its citizens alive and healthy. The justification that they give for this is that astronauts do important work and treating them to good foods on occasion is a small price to pay to keep their morale up, and the work they're doing will eventually lead to technology such as early warning systems which will protect her constituents. It's such a ridiculous reach, and it doesn't justify it at all. Even if this was the case and people's lives were saved thanks to knowing natural disasters in advance, does it improve the overall standard of their lives? Of course it doesn't. Yet despite this, the show treats this as a gotcha moment, as discount AOC stands down looking defeated, and it all feels like it belongs in a SJWs Get Owned compilation. As I said earlier, space exploration is a necessity, but if you're going to justify Space Force's even most noble pursuits, then at least do more than say astronauts work best when they eat dried fruits and treats. Despite this though, the show did have something good to say about the private sector getting involved in space travel in episode 7, but its message still ends up being muddled. There's a tech billionaire, Edison James, who's much like human-sized skin tag Elon Musk. She wants to sell her experimental, eco-friendly rocket fuel to the government, but it turns out it's not as great as she says it is, having caused explosions on numerous occasions during the testing period. Before the launch, which is supposed to be using this fuel, some members of Space Force find out about its faults and replace it with regular fuel, but as far as the public is aware, her fuel is still in it. The message is that even though people like her or Musk might want to help advance space exploration, they're ultimately involved in these projects because there's profit to be had, and they're not subjected to the same level of accountability that government-funded projects do. And it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of money SpaceX receives for their research and development is actually from the taxpayer, having received over $5 billion in government support by the end of 2018 and gained over $2 billion in profit by the end of 2019, profit that the taxpayer doesn't receive any benefits from. However, the message behind these events are still muddied. Space Force might no longer have confidence in this company anymore, but as far as the public's aware, Edison's fuel is still powering that rocket. It is a resounding success, bolstering their confidence in the private sector over the public sector, and more than likely increasing the stock value of their already extremely valuable company. Space Force is a show that feels like it has something important to say, but rather than sticking to one side, it chooses the middle, and in its attempts to criticize the existence of the real-life Space Force, more often than not it ends up validating its existence.
Because an orange, like the Earth itself, is perfect and round.
It's a flat rectangle.
Conclusion. I don't know, just put something funny here, I guess, just cut this part out. I really wanted Space Force to be great. I'm sure everyone did, why wouldn't you? I wanted it to be another show that whenever I'm bored and I'm lost for something to watch, I could just put it on again in the background while I do something else and it would keep my spirits up. Unfortunately, all we got was a highly produced, run-of-the-mill comedy with no identity of its own, a wasted cast, sloppy writing, and no real message behind it. The makers of this show are obviously capable of better, and I do genuinely hope that when it returns, it will be better. That's been the case with Greg Daniels' other shows, so maybe he'll do the same again. It is more than likely that it will come back too. From what we can tell, it performed well despite the overall negative reception from critics, having garnered a score of 48 on Metacritic for its first season. Throughout this video, I have kept invoking Daniels' name when it comes to criticizing Space Force, but that might not be entirely fair. Steve Carell has a co-creator credit on the show, and there's no way of knowing how much of this is his project. What I did find is that he doesn't see the show as being partisan, but considers it as a surprisingly patriotic show. In that respect, for better or worse, he's not wrong. But in this case, that's not necessarily admirable. I personally don't think that patriotism is a good thing, but if someone was to be, I'd hope that this means that they're willing to be truly critical of their country and hope for a meaningful change, rather than taking a project like Space Force and hoping to make lemonade out of lemons. There's a reason good satire doesn't celebrate its subjects, and that's because there largely isn't anything to celebrate about them. If you're going to punch up to people in power with your comedy, then don't feel the need to apologize or commend them. Let them take it as a message that they need to be held accountable. I hope that in the future, that if or when Space Force figures out what it wants to be, that it'll be something good and lives up to the potential we saw in it. But as comedies and satires and dramas go, right now it's light years behind everything that came before it. Hey, I managed to find another space pun, just in time too. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, then please consider liking, subscribing, etc. What did you think of Space Force? Do you feel the same as me, or did you actually like it? I want to hear it if you did. Otherwise, take care of yourself, take care of everyone else, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.